Hey, welcome to the first content lecture for writing in psychology. Today, what I want you to think about, what question I want you to ponder before we even begin is how APA style might possibly be like the DSM. So how is the style we're going to write in this semester, that of the American Psychological Association, similar to the APA's Diagnostic and Statistical Manual? Is there a similar line to be drawn between the two of them? We'll answer that by the end. So the learning outcomes for this lecture are that by the end of the video, you'll be able to describe the utility of communicating in a singular style. You will be able to compare APA citations to MLA citations and talk about what's different and why it's different. And you'll also be able to list and describe the various types of journal articles. That'll sort of be part 2 of this video. So part 1, why bother using APA style? The first and biggest reason for us to adopt it in this course and for across your psych courses and across all of psychology is that it is a standard format. It enables us to have clear expectations about each other's writing. It enables us to find cited items quickly and easily. It enables us to read more efficiently because we know the kind of language and the kind of structure that's going to be used. And it really just in general makes all of our communication a little bit easier. It comes with a cost, at least at the beginning, and it is that you kind of have to learn it a little bit like a language. Some people describe this process as a kind of code switching in and out of the way we regularly talk and the way we might talk or write in this academic setting in this APA style or format. So you can think of it that way as well. APA was designed as a style with 4 goals separate to the sort of overarching idea of establishing a standard format for us all. The first of those goals is precision. We want our language to be precise. We want it to not be confusable. We want to only say exactly what we mean, and we want to be able to describe every facet of the concept we're trying to explain to our reader. So all of that is handled in with the idea of precision. Both in writing and in citation style, you want to be able to get to exactly the paper that the writer was intending for you to get to when you read a citation that they put in. Another goal of APA style is objectivity. This is necessary for science overall, and so it's of course necessary for psychological science. We need to express objectivity in our writing, and so there are a couple of rules in the style of APA and a couple of sort of more softly stated suggestions that lead to the suggestion of objectivity. You want to seem like an objective writer. You don't want to interject too much opinion into a piece of APA writing, at least not well-reasoned and careful and scientifically objective opinion. It shouldn't seem like there's a personal stake in this for you as a writer. It should seem that you are not being subjective at all. Another goal of APA style and its development is organization. This is pretty closely related to the kind of standard format issues. The idea that if we know how an article is going to process, then we have an easier time making our way through the article. I know that it's probably going to show me, if it's an empirical article, some kind of introduction, their methodology, their results, and then some discussion section. Different journals you'll find organize these things a little bit differently. Sometimes the methods section is pushed to the end, and it just kind of depends. Science, one of the biggest journals in all of science, hence the name, is organized like that. They have method sections at the end of the paper, and that can be confusing for students at first, but for the most part, we have this standard organization. By the way, science doesn't necessarily adhere to APA style. They have a different style they use, so their organization may not always match ours. But for us, that kind of organization is key. Organization within sentences, within paragraphs is also something we think about. We want to make sure that we're always presenting information in the way of a claim followed immediately by the evidence for that claim. And then we know that those kinds of really small-grained organizations are going to be followed by the larger organization that is the arc of an argument through, say, a review section, and then moving on from there into a method section if it's an empirical paper. The fourth goal of APA style is that it helps us make logical arguments. That's that same kind of organization idea, but more specifically thinking about that claim and evidence kind of structure. We can make logical arguments clearly if we are all three of the other goals. If we are precise, objective, and organized in our thinking and in our writing, then we can make sound logical arguments. So APA is both a style and a format. In terms of style, we seek to establish clarity in our writing. We don't want the sentences to be confusing. We don't want paragraphs to be confusing when all the sentences are combined. The writing should be literal. There doesn't need to be a lot of figurative language. You don't need to draw similes. You don't need to build really long, complicated, sort of flowery dialogue or use all that many adjectives and adverbs. We're talking about literal things here, and so we should write in a literal way, again, according to APA. We seek brevity. We want things to be short. You might find that that doesn't seem like it's one of the bigger goals of APA in certain places, but brevity is one of the defining features of the style, and in most cases, psychology journals try to ensure brevity in their published articles by imposing word limits. So a lot of articles are only as long as the journal would let them be in order to encourage brevity. Credibility is key. We want to seem like we are doing good, careful science. We want to be believable. Otherwise, what's the point of reading any psychology article? And so the style should lend itself to good credibility. And we want to emphasize our evidence-based approach, the fact that, again, psychology is building upon years and years of science. It utilizes the same scientific method as every other science. And so if we approach our questions with good, sound, logical argumentation and thought, we can display our evidence-based approach. And again, the style really leans on objectivity. We want to avoid biased language as much as possible, particularly when we do things like study difficult topics. Like if you're studying emotion, you don't want to speak about it emotionally. You don't want to write about it emotionally. You need to show objectivity in your writing. Now, of course, this doesn't mean that you have to be objective in your entire life, right? Scientists are also people, and sometimes that humanity can seep into a piece of writing in APA style, but for the most part, the goal is to treat the scientist side of yourself as kind of a little separate from the more typical everyday side of yourself, when you're writing, at least. There's a format side to this as well. We want an article to kind of look scientific, and so they do those kinds of, they make decisions around the rules regarding numbers and commas and font based on those kinds of classic science-y looking kinds of periodicals and articles. You might be asking, why don't we use some other citation source? In my English class in high school, we used MLA. Why don't we use MLA in psychology? I don't feel like learning a new citation method. Well, to answer that, I will cite the same article for you in both MLA and APA style on this slide here. So in both cases, you would add a URL or these days a digital object identifier or DOI at the end there. So you can kind of ignore that. But see if you can tell which is which. If you're not sure, take a guess. The top one is MLA. The bottom is APA. Think about what the differences are here. What do you notice really clearly and quickly that's different? There's some kind of small things. There's quotation marks around the article title in the MLA format. You could see that as being less science-y, perhaps, I guess. You could argue that for formatting reasons, we don't put quotations around article titles. In APA, the first names are not listed, and some of that is to infuse a sense of objectivity. In an MLA piece, who wrote it actually is very important. Who the author is, what their opinions are, what their context is surrounding their writing. But for an APA article, we should not be concerned with the authors because they should be representing a completely objective and evidence-based argument, and so who they are shouldn't matter as much. In fact, what matters more is when they did this work, and so you can see why the year is much earlier in APA than it is in MLA. The reason for that is that an opinion, a piece of writing in the humanities, ages as well as it's written. Something written decades ago can be as vital today as it was when it was written. But when we think about science and social science, it moves forward and builds upon itself over time. And so we really need to know exactly when an article was published in order to know whether we should assume that more work has been done in this field since it was published. And if that's the case, we should seek to find that newer evidence, or we should at least compare the old to the new so that we know where the science is at now. Because science isn't an all or nothing enterprise. It's not a simple yes or no question. What we do in science is we slowly make our way toward the truth. And we might have missteps along the way, but the idea is that we are slowly zeroing in on the truth of that construct, whatever it may be. And so it's thus crucial to know exactly when these scientists did this work and published this work, so the year appears much earlier. The APA Style Guide was first published in 1929 in order to make the point that the quality of our writing as psychologists reflects the quality of our thinking. They emphasize the fact that in order to be doing good science, we must be communicating that science to each other. And up until then, psychology operated for the first several decades of its existence as a science dominated by several big figures who were mostly writing about their own musings and their own discoveries about themselves and some of their patients. And so in order to try to move psychology in a more objective and evidence-based direction, the APA established these guidelines. And so in addition to the fact that communicating to our colleagues the exact work we did as an important value, we also have to work on communicating so that others can understand what we did, so that other people can possibly do it again or change it slightly and do a slightly different experiment. And for these rules, again, first came out in 1929. They're updated periodically. In fact, the 7th edition just came out in 2019. It looks like I wrote here October 2019. What I'm getting at when I'm starting to talk about the fact that science requires communication and you have to communicate it so that others understand, we're kind of getting on the edge of a topic called audience. Most of science is written for other scientists, written to be read by other scientists. These are the journal articles, the things we're going to be mostly reading in this course and throughout the rest of your psych degree. Journal articles, again, mostly are read by other researchers. They're sometimes read by practitioners out in the field. Like, let's say you have a study in which you have developed a new way to detect truth from a liar. A police officer might read that study and try to go and implement your technique. So practitioners read it sometimes, read these articles. And really anyone else trying to apply the science could read them as well. And depending on the science you're doing, you can imagine all kinds of different situations where people might try to apply it. Let's say you work in developmental psychology. You could imagine a new mother trying to read your study and figure out what to take away from it as she raises her baby. And so scientists don't always only write in APA style because they don't always only write for other researchers and practitioners. Sometimes we adopt non-APA formats to try to write to news media, news outlets. Some people have research blogs where they try to communicate their science more colloquially. But really, anytime you're trying to tell non-scientists about your work, you're going to have to adopt a slightly different set of rules. One of those instances in which you might adopt slightly different rules is in class, by the way. You have a very specific audience for your writing, and it is your professor, and so you need to follow the instructions that person gives you very, very specifically. So if you're looking to apply this even more widely, I advise you to consider this concept and the first couple chunks of this course as an intense practice in attention to detail. The attention to detail will be critical for the course, critical for your career as well, in really no matter what kind of career you have. Attention to detail is always a highly sought after attribute in an employee. We're going to learn some new procedures. We're going to try to develop the skills that others avoid, and again, pay really close attention to detail. All things that are very valuable in the workplace, all things that you can throw on a resume after you've completed this course. So it is not only true that scientists write to different audiences, be they each other, popular media, a blog, or, I wrote an email to my grandmother a couple of months ago about some scientific findings. Or to your professor. Imagine all these different audiences. Even within the one audience of other researchers, there is a fairly wide variety of different types of articles that we can publish. We'll go through each in detail in just a minute, and I'll show you some of the summary paragraphs at the beginning so that we can start to recognize what they look like, and you'll use that skill in one of your first assignments for this class. So just really quickly, they are empirical studies or empirical articles, literature reviews, theoretical articles, which can look a lot like literature reviews, methodological articles, case studies, and then you can kind of even break it down further and further from there. People publish things called brief reports, which are often empirical studies, but really simple ones reported in short articles. Sometimes people publish comments on previously published work that can look a lot like a theoretical article or a lit review. Book reviews, obituaries, letters to the editor, all these kinds of things appear in psychological journals just the same as they do in any other kind of periodical that you might imagine. It's usually clear, though, what kind of article each is in a little summary paragraph that appears at the beginning of them all, which we call the abstract. An empirical study is sort of the crown jewel of all this. They're the thing that we're doing all this for. An empirical study is a report of some piece of original research. This scientist went out and collected these data in this way, and they are reporting the process to you and their findings in this empirical article. It will have an introduction in almost every case that will describe the problem that they seek to solve, the question that they seek to answer, the past research done in that area, and a statement of their purpose. Then they'll describe their methodology. What procedures did they do? Who did they recruit to do them? What kinds of materials did they need and use? Did they develop any themselves? And then they'll tell you the results. Here are the data. Here are my findings. Here's how I analyzed my data to get to these findings. And then they will discuss. So they'll summarize their findings and give you their interpretation of the findings, again, based in objectivity and logic, and then makes usually some statements about the implications of those findings, so what they mean for the wider world. So you kind of start at the very beginning really wide. Why does this matter? And develop the problem, and then you dig in really specifically to the things that have been done previously, and then exactly what I'm going to do here. Here's exactly what I did, and then you come out on the other end and you widen back out and say, here's the implications of what I've just done. Has a kind of hourglass shape. And these empirical studies are what you will read most when you're looking at journal articles. They're the things we are going to most often ask you to go and find in psychology in all your courses. Here's an example of an abstract from a paper of mine in which we talked about some empirical work. This one very nicely has sections in it. It tells you, all right, here's the background, here's the results, here's the conclusions. Not every abstract is going to do this, but some will. It just depends on the journal. Every journal has different rules within the structures of APA style. So, though the sections won't be labeled like this, they will all be included in any Empirical Articles abstract. You should be able to find some statement of participants. Who did they recruit and how many? And that's usually probably the best giveaway that somebody conducted empirical research. They'll talk about who their participants were. But apart from that, you need to look to see that it has all the rest of those sections to ensure that you've got an empirical article. Here's another example. I invite you to look in your own time. Go ahead and pause this video and see if you can identify the introduction, method, results, and discussion section in this little abstract. The other most common article you'll find in most publications and assigned in most classes is a literature review. Lit reviews evaluate material that's already been published. Usually what they'll do is they will bring together many empirical studies and cite them and discuss them together and try to come to a conclusion about what they all mean as a unit, as a series of studies in one long line seeking toward this inevitable but sometimes hard to get to truth that is the answer to the question in that realm of psychological science. So typically they'll try to organize them in some sensible way to help guide you through their interpretation of them and evaluate them. Evaluate the quality of each one, evaluate the contribution of each one, and then evaluate overall the progress of the field toward the solution to their particular problem. They'll also try to identify gaps. Here's things missing from this area of research. Inconsistencies, contradictions. These people found this, but these people found the opposite. How do we deal with that? Those are the kinds of things that folks will deal with in a literature review. They'll usually finish by suggesting steps to solve problems they see in the literature and to, again, continue to try to solve the big problem, the big question that they're dealing with in that subsection of literature. So the sort of confusing piece of this is that a literature review looks a lot like the introduction section of some empirical articles. So the key is if you're reading a thing and you go, this is all intro, you're probably reading a lit review. We'll talk in more detail about that in just a second. But you could argue that an empirical article starts with a short lit review as opposed to a lit review being a lit review the entire way through. There are some kind of subtypes of literature reviews, the main one being meta-analysis. This is a procedure in which a researcher takes data from many studies and combines them together to try to see whether there is a major conclusion to be reached from the research as a whole. So the same kind of goal as a lit review, except that they work more quantitatively. They work with the data rather than with the language and the argumentation and the logic. They do all those things too, but in a lit review classic, you won't see quantitative things discussed. You won't hear about how many people were in each of these 50 studies and here's how I combine their data. But if you're hearing that and you aren't seeing new data collected, then you're probably reading a meta-analysis. Not a terrible idea to try to avoid those, especially early on in your major. Once you get into it, once you get into a specific field, meta-analyses are amazing. They're huge, important, excellent tools for trying to figure out where a research area is at a given time. There are entire journals dedicated to lit reviews. Wired Psychology is one. Perspectives on Psychological Science is another. You can find them all over the place. Here's a sample abstract for a lit review. This is another one that I wrote. Pause and read if you like. You'll see here that you very clearly will not be able to find a method section or a results section. We're just talking about the progress of an area of research. A theoretical article will present previous research to advance some kind of theoretical issue in which someone maybe is trying to make a specific argument about which way the field should move forward. They will probably trace the development of a theory and try to analyze exactly what it means, drill into the specifics of its logic, and then refine it if they think it needs refining. So these kinds of articles might develop new ideas, new definitions, or new constructs, and they might also point out flaws in previous research. They can look, again, not too different from literature reviews. There are also entire journals that publish methodological articles, and these are articles in which the researchers focused on some kind of data analysis or methodological innovation. They will mainly present data, they may present data, but it'll usually only be to illustrate their new method or their new analysis. It might not be original data. These kinds of articles are also usually really highly technical. One journal for that is abbreviation is AMPS. I believe it's Advances in Methodology and something Psychological Science. I can't remember the middle P. Sorry. It's an APS journal. So if you go to psychologicalscience.org, you can find AMPS. Another type of publication is a case study. This is a report of working with usually a singular subject. So that singular subject can be a person, can be a group of people, or a community, or an organization. And it's a little like an empirical article. We're talking about new information, and we're talking more here about qualitative data. So a case study will typically illustrate a problem and shed light on some kind of needed application, usually has a clinical bent to it, but not always. And in these cases, there's a lot of care taken around the confidentiality of the participants in the research. So as I said, there are other types of papers you might find in journals. There are also other types of papers you might have to write while you're a college student. Assignments can vary quite tremendously from one class to another, from one beginning of one course to the end of it. You might have a term paper where you're focused on a particular topic or a particular question, so you need to formulate some kind of thesis based on past literature. You might write a project proposal in which you review relevant literature and then finish by outlining some hypothesis and methodological idea. By the end of Research Methods and Stats 2, you will complete a full project report in which you'll review the literature, you'll explain a methodology, you'll do statistical analysis, and then write your conclusions. Our goal in this course is to essentially spend the semester writing our own lit review. We're going to look at the past literature in a focused area. We're not going to go as far as proposing a study. We're going to do kind of the term paper version of this. You could also maybe think of it as a position paper within the realm of psychology. So, we've come all the way back around to the beginning. How is APA style like the DSM? I probably should have animated this slide so I could give you a second to think about it. The answer I came up with is that both have pros and cons. There are limitations to APA style. I don't particularly love the intensity of the objectivity in it. I think that scientists are people, and to try to fully remove our humanity from our writing is, number one, not very fun to read, but number two, a little dishonest. I think that, to pretend like a scientist can ever be perfectly objective is not fully true. This is a philosophy of science question for a different day, but when APA established these guidelines back in the early part of the 1900s, they needed a really strong injection of objectivity into the writing. So it makes sense, but I personally try to push on that whenever I can. But the rest of it I quite like. Having this shared language, this shared methodology of writing is in general a very good thing. But the DSM also has pros and cons, which you can find in another video of mine if you so desire, but it's something we talk about in Gen Psych and Clinical Psych. But both of these things, this style guideline set and the diagnostic and statistical manual, have this sort of same pro, which is they ensure clear and efficient communication among psychologists. They enable us to do our work, basically. It would take so long to describe a study to somebody else if we all talked with different terms, with different definitions, and tried to write across different styles. It would just be a mess. So the ability to and the necessity to kind of find a common ground there to put ourselves all into the same style box really helps. Really helps communication. Same as in the DSM, you couldn't figure out why one person diagnosed with bipolar might act the same way that another person does, unless you had the definition and the typical symptoms of bipolar 1, for example. So that's the end of this first video. Thanks for watching. See you in the next one.